Okay, let us continue. Indicate if you can hear me. All right, good. All right, so now that we've looked at the structures, we're gonna follow the flow of blood through the circulatory system. So we need to be able to follow that movement of the blood within the circulatory system. So let's start on the right side, right? So we're gonna start on the deoxygenated side. So deoxygenated blood from the upper portion of the body and lower portion of the body will travel via the superior and inferior vena cava, and that blood will empty into the right atrium. Right, so deoxygenated blood from the upper portion of the body and the lower portion of the body will travel via the superior and inferior vena cava, and that blood will flow into the right atrium. The right atrium then contracts and pushes that deoxygenated blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, right? The right ventricle then contracts and pumps that deoxygenated blood through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary artery, which branches into the left pulmonary artery and right pulmonary artery, right? So the deoxygenated blood is transported to the lungs. Now, when the right pulmonary artery is transporting this when the pulmonary artery is transporting this deoxygenated blood, it will further break down into pulmonary arterioles, right? When it breaks down into pulmonary arterioles, it will then break down further into pulmonary capillaries. These pulmonary capillaries are wrapped around the alveoli, right? Now, at the point that this deoxygenated blood reaches the pulmonary capillaries, air also reaches the alveoli. So that's air that we have breathed in from the atmosphere. That air has a high concentration of oxygen. So oxygen will now diffuse into the blood inside of the capillaries, right? And that's the high pressure side of the capillaries now. So oxygen diffuses in, carbon dioxide leaves the blood and enters the alveoli. So now the blood becomes oxygenated. So the oxygenated side of the pulmonary capillaries will become pulmonary venules. Then these pulmonary venules will become pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins will now transport the oxygenated blood to the left atrium. So this is the oxygenated blood coming from the lungs. It will be transported to the left atrium. The left atrium then contracts and pumps that oxygenated blood into the left ventricle. So it passes through the bicuspid or mitral valve and enters the left ventricle. the left ventricle then contracts and pumps the oxygenated blood through the aorta, which closes. When the aorta closes, the coronary arteries fill with backflow, right? Or laminal flow, I should say. Then the aorta divides into the ascending and descending, right? The left ventricle pumps the oxygenated blood through the aortic valve, which closes off, and that blood is then transported to the upper portion of the body and the lower portion of the body, where it will the aorta will now break down into systemic arteries, which become systemic arterioles, which becomes systemic capillaries. The systemic capillaries form a net over the cells within the body. At that point, oxygen leaves the systemic capillaries and enter the cells, and the cells give up CO2, which enters the capillaries, systemic capillaries. So now the cell has the oxygen that it needs to metabolize. The blood now becomes deoxygenated again. So the deoxygenated side of the systemic capillary will then become systemic venules, which will then become systemic veins, which then forms back the vena cava, and the process continues, right? So the process go again. So it's a closed network. It's a closed network of movement. So let me review that one more time, and then I'll ask a question to see if you understand. All right. So starting on the right side, we're looking at the movement of blood. They must be able to follow the movement of blood through the circulatory system. Deoxygenated blood from the upper portion of the body and the lower portion of the body will travel via the superior and inferior vena cava. That blood will then enter the right atrium. The right atrium contracts and pushes that deoxygenated blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle then contracts and pumps that deoxygenated blood through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary arteries, which is going to the left and right lung. The pulmonary arteries will then break down into pulmonary arterioles. Then the pulmonary arterioles will break down into pulmonary capillaries. The pulmonary capillaries are wrapped around the alveoli. At the point that the deoxygenated blood is passing through the pulmonary capillaries, air from the atmosphere, which contains a high concentration of oxygen, would be in the alveoli. So oxygen diffuses out of the alveoli into the capillaries, and CO2 diffuses from the capillaries into the alveoli. So the blood is now oxygenated. So on the oxygenated side of the pulmonary capillaries, they will form the pulmonary venules. Then the pulmonary venules will form the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins will now transport this oxygenated blood to the left atrium. The left atrium contracts and pumps the blood through the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will now contract and pump that oxygenated blood through the aortic valve into the aorta, which divides into ascending and descending. This blood is then transported to the systems in the upper and lower portion of the body. The aorta further breaks down into systemic arteries. These systemic arteries break down into systemic arterioles, which becomes systemic capillaries. These capillaries form a net over the cells. The cells give up the CO2 that it contains and accepts the oxygen. So the oxygen moves from the systemic capillaries into the cell gives up the CO2, the cell gets the energy that it needs, carry out its function. The blood now becomes deoxygenated again. So the deoxygenated systemic capillaries, blood in the systemic capillaries on the deoxygenated side, the systemic capillaries will now form the systemic venules. The systemic venules will further form systemic veins. Then these veins will further form the inferior and superior vena cava, and the process occurs again. So it's a closed network, right? The circulation of blood within the body is a closed network. If the network open, the patient will bleed to death. All right. Now, let's see if you understood anything I just mentioned regarding the circulation of blood. So you all will answer this question. I'm not going to tell you if your answer is right or wrong until everybody has given a response. So listen carefully to the question before you answer. So the right ventricle, right, is responsible for receiving blood from the right atrium and pumping that blood into the pumping that blood into the pulmonary arteries, right? The right ventricle is responsible for receiving blood from the right atrium and pumping that blood through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary artery. However, the right ventricle is damaged, right? So the right ventricle is damaged. In other words, the patient have a heart attack on the right side, specifically right ventricle. So it's no longer able to carry out its function effectively. What do you think would happen? That's the question, right? So the right ventricle is responsible for receiving blood from the right atrium and pumping that blood through the pulmonic valve to the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. However, the patient has a heart attack, right ventricle, so it's damaged. What are you expecting to happen to this particular patient? Go ahead, Mr. Wilson.
Okay, so for my response, sir, is that the flow of carbon dioxide and deoxygenated blood will not take place within that process because eventually it will need to go to the lungs, to the pulmonary capillaries to refill and recycle back through the left atrium to flow back out. So eventually, no flow of deoxygenated blood will take place in that part, sir.
Okay, I hear you. Go ahead, Michael Wilson.
Well, sir, man, I think say if your system work like a plumbing system, then alright, I pipes them. In other words, once no flow not take place from the right ventricle, I'll have it'll be flooded, and basically, because it not carry out the function to continue the loop. Because it always have to circulate to prevent it from backing up.
Okay, I hear you. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Cameron. And whoever else is there.
All right. Johnson here, sir. Morning.
Yes, morning.
All right. The understanding of this thing, when the oxygenated blood come down in the right ventricle, once the muscle can't get to contract because of some blockage, pressure will build up in it, so it can't get to go through to the pulmonary artery. So no exchange of gas can go on a little bushy thing there. So you get the oxygenated blood. But the capillary part in there.
Yeah, man, I hear you.
So I said pressure will build up because you have your the oxygenated blood at back up because it can't get to go through the valve thing so at the end valve, right? So
All right.
so the thing out. Yeah. All right.
On that side, if you have anything different. So who else is there with you, Johnson? What are their views? Is it the same as yours?
All right, sir, sit here.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the fact that say the right side function as norm. All right, so eventually the oxygen within the body basically deplete and use up. So you find that this situation become cyanotic in terms of the skin color change. All right, a cold and clammy. You might have, I would say, you might have swelling somewhat to the feet as well. It's
Okay.
the fact that the blood now flow as how it should to the body.
All right. I hear you. Who else on that side? Anybody else?
Sir, Shantel, sir.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I also observed that in the right atrium, the oxygenated blood it now really pass through the ventricle at that point, so there will be a slight swelling actually in that area.
Okay. All right. All right. I hear you. Um.
Manning here, sir. So my partake on it is there's an issue in the right atrium where the actual deoxygenated blood needs to be pumped into the right ventricle, right? It simply means because it's a closed loop system. If any part close off, there's gonna be an issue. As you mentioned, the person has a heart attack, which basically are going to lead up to which can cause the patients being unconscious because the oxygenated blood in the body will become fewer and fewer because you need the deoxygenated part to continue the cycle, to go ahead and bind with the oxygen molecules. And if there's any blockage, that can happen.
Okay. How about that, Mr. Cameron? I was trying to mute you, and I ended up removing. Go ahead.
Sir, just for clarity, could you please repeat the question?
The question is, the right ventricle is responsible for receiving deoxygenated blood from the right atrium and pumping that blood through the pulmonic valve to the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. However, the patient has a heart attack on the right side, so it's damaged, right? The right ventricle is damaged, so it cannot carry out its function effectively. What do you think is going to happen? That's the question. Mr. Terrell.
Yes, sir.
What is your response?
Sir.
Go ahead.
All right, so if there's a problem with the right ventricle as a result of not being able to receive the oxygenated blood from the right atrium, there will be a build-up of oxygenated blood. So this will affect the flow from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery. And this might result in a stroke because of lack of oxygen to the brain.
Cool. Okay. All right. Mr. Powell.
Yes, sir. With failure in the right ventricle to output blood to the lungs, you have a buildup of blood that would start building up in the ventricle.
Connection
The
bad
right
now.
area, the right atrium, that is, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Right. So
So
I got the concept of what you're saying. All right, you can mute your mic. No, your connection is dropping. Mute your mic. All right. So the question that I just asked is this is how you will determine if, when you're studying anatomy and physiology, you understand what you're studying, right? So the question that I'm asking you, for you to be able to understand what is going to happen, it means you have to reverse the anatomy, right? And when you reverse anatomy, that's what we call pathophysiology. And this is how the patient is going to present. So if the patient has a heart attack in the right ventricle, if the right ventricle is damaged, it means it cannot receive and distribute blood effectively. So if what is going to happen is the right ventricle would be collecting blood, but it's not distributing that blood effectively. So you're gonna get a buildup of blood in the right ventricle, right? Which creates a back pressure. That pressure is gonna end up on the tricuspid valve and cause the tricuspid valve to fail. And you start to get a back pressure in the right atrium. When you start to get that back pressure in the right atrium, eventually that pressure will end up in your superior vena cava and your inferior vena cava, right? So the patient's neck veins are going to start popping up. We call that distended neck veins. As the pressure build up in the inferior vena cava, the liver is going to become enlarged. The patient is going to start to collect plasma in the lower extremity, so they get pedal edema, right? This is a patient that is going into heart failure, right side heart failure. This is what the patient will present like in the field. So if something is wrong with the ventricles, you will get a back pressure wherever the blood is coming from, right? If something is wrong with the ventricles, a back pressure will be created wherever the blood is coming from. Now, if this problem is not corrected, eventually the left side of the heart is going to be affected, right? So if the right side of the heart starts to fail and that problem is not addressed, eventually the left side will start to fail. And then we get what is called congestive heart failure, which is both sides failing. Now, with the same concept, if it's in the same concept, if the left ventricle is responsible for receiving blood from the left atrium, right? The left ventricle is responsible for receiving oxygenated blood from the left atrium and pumping that blood into the aorta and the rest of the body. If the patient gets a myocardial infarction or heart attack in the left ventricle, where is the fluid going to back up? Or where's the pressure going to end up? So that's the next question. Waiting for answers.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
All right. The left ventricle is responsible for receiving oxygenated blood and pumping that oxygenated blood into the aorta to the rest of the body. If the patient gets a MI or heart attack on the left side, where is the back pressure going to end up? That's the question. Go ahead. Yes, Mr. Patrick Wilson, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, sir. From my understanding, sir, basically the body has done a complete cycle already. So to me, sir, it would have been ending up in the right atrium, sir.
Okay, so you said the right atrium. All right, I hear you.
Yes, sir.
Cameron.
So the right atrium.
Right atrium. Anybody else have anything different?
In the lung.
Who's saying the lung? Who is that? Oil. Okay. Michael, Mr. Michael Wilson, what you say?
Sir, may I say you're right, atrium.
Right atrium. Okay. Mr. Terrell. Yes, Mr. Money.
Yes, sir. I would say it's the reverse, just the same as when it was on the right side. So in this case, now that it's on the left side, it would be the same direction where the blood came in to the left art what's that? Atrium. So it'd be basically the pulmonary veins on the left side that brings the oxygenated blood go straight back. So based on the diagram, go straight back to the capillaries and to the lung side, basically in that direction that brought the blood to it. So it's like a reverse.
Okay. Smith.
Yes, sir. Smith here. Yes, so I agree with Money. It's on the fact that the right left ventricle where all of the pressure will build up from the atrium go back to the lungs, back to the right side of the heart.
Okay. Anybody else have anything different than that? All right. So who is this now?
John Phillips, sir.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir. The right lungs would also be affected, sir, as the backing up the right atrium, the valves. Yes, sir. The right lung will be also affected.
Okay.
There are some breathing issues in that case.
All right. I hear it. I hear it.
Sir,
Yes.
Cameron here. Pull back my answer. Not
Okay.
the right atrium, but actually lungs.
The lungs.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. All right. So just as before, right? Just as before. Remember what I said previously. If any of the ventricles are damaged, you'll get a back pressure to where the blood is coming from, right? Now, if the left ventricle is damaged because of a myocardial infarction or heart attack, you will get a backflow on the, you're gonna get a build-up of pressure in the left ventricle, right? Because the left ventricle is receiving blood, but it's not distributing that blood fast enough through the aorta. So you'll get a back pressure that builds up on the mitral or bicuspid valve. The valve can't close properly. Then you have a back pressure building up in the left atrium, and you start to get a back pressure in the pulmonary veins. You have 4 pulmonary veins, 2 that is coming from the left, 2 that is coming from the right lung. Remember now that the pulmonary veins are developing from pulmonary venules, right? And pulmonary venules are developing from pulmonary capillaries. When you start to get a back pressure in the capillaries, remember what I said previously, one cell at a time, right? So if it's one cell at a time, what is going to happen is significant pressure will be created in the pulmonary capillaries. And what is going to happen is plasma starts to be pushed out into the alveoli. So the patient starts to get fluid into their lungs. That's pulmonary edema, right? Now, the patient will, I think somebody said it, I don't remember who it was. The patient is definitely going to start to develop trouble breathing. You're going to see that early, right? And the reason for that is if fluid is in the alveoli, oxygen can pass through that fluid. So the patient is going to develop difficulty breathing. Now, some of you mentioned about the right atrium failing. That's not going to happen right away. It is something that will ultimately occur if you don't fix the problem on the left side. So this is a patient in left side heart failure. In left side heart failure, you get a back pressure into the pulmonary capillaries, which forces plasma or interstitial fluid into the alveoli, right? So the patient develops pulmonary edema. If that problem is not corrected, ultimately the right side of the heart is going to fail as well, and the patient will develop congestive heart failure. Now, the difference is one will occur much faster than the other, and I'm sure you can understand why, right? So if it's right side, it takes longer for the left side to fail. If it's left side, it's gonna cause an issue with the lungs first. So the patient will start to develop signs and symptoms much faster than if it was the right side. But if the issue on the left is not corrected, the right side will fail. And it's the same thing on the right side. If the right side is failing and the issue is not corrected, the left side will fail, but you have more time with that patient. So you have more time with a patient with the right side heart failure in comparison with a patient with left side, because the lungs is significantly affected if it's left side heart failure. Yes, Mr. Cameron.
Yeah.
What was that?
Johnson.
Yes, go ahead.
All right, you mentioned about the cell them in the capillary, like say one cell at a time pass through.
Right.
Right. So the same thing what we did talk about earlier on with some high pressure fluid, since because the cell them can't pass through enough because of the blockage and the plasma alone leave. Is there any the plasma would have seep or some exchange with the plasma in the lungs?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, you know. I'm saying when the pressure is created at the capillary level, plasma will be pushed out of the capillary into the lungs. So that would be exactly what's happening, just as you said. Yes.
Sir, the blood pressure for that patient would be extremely elevated.
Usually a patient with congestive heart failure is going to have a pressure that's moving upward. If you start to see the pressure drop, it means that the side of the heart that is damaged is significantly damaged, right? So if they have a massive heart attack, then you won't see a high pressure. you're gonna see a low pressure, and that's actually cardiogenic shock. So apart from the heart failure, they're going into cardiogenic shock. Yes, but usually the pressure is not gonna be low, it tends to be higher. So yes, that would be correct. All right, so as I said, the purpose of the question is for you to understand what the whole concept of critical thinking is. When you're studying anatomy and physiology, if you cannot reverse the anatomy and physiology, you don't understand it, right? So if you don't know what is going to happen if that structure cannot carry out its function, you don't understand the anatomy and physiology. So that is the level that you need to be at. Why? The patient in front of you will not tell you that he has heart failure, right? I'm not gonna say to you the right side of my heart or fail or the left side. You have to know what to look for. That tells you that, okay, it's possible that this patient is going into right side or left side or both sides failing, right? So it's about patient presentation. And when it comes to patient presentation, we're looking at pathophysiology. All right, what time is it? 10 o'clock. So with that said, take a break. 15 minutes. That was a lot.
Yeah, easy no boss.